On Primetime Politics Weekend, new rules for a changing world.
Geopolitics has changed. We need to change as well. We need to have processes in place. We need to be more vigilant.
The federal government proposes additional requirements for foreign investment and lays a roadmap for critical minerals, both prioritizing national security in the face of changing geopolitics. Coming up, we will speak to the Industry Minister François-Philippe Champagne.
It was the right moment to have those conversations about labor rights, about the LGBTQ community as well, and their rights.
The sports minister drops by to discuss discrimination at the World Cup and the challenge of making amateur sport more inclusive in this country.
Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives are nothing if not at least consistent. They continue to ask us to stop being there to support Canadians.
We're about to enter the last week before Parliament rises for the year. What should you be watching for? This is Primetime Politics Weekend. Hello everyone, I'm Michael Serapio. With illegal Chinese police stations in the country, allegations of election interference, and what the government calls China's disruptive presence in global politics, national security has been top of mind in Ottawa. The Trudeau government is now turning its attention to foreign investment, critical minerals, and protecting Canadian assets that might be vulnerable. And for more on that, we are now reaching out to the Minister for Innovation, Science and Industry, François-Philippe Champagne. Minister, thank you for being with us.
Thanks for having me, Michael. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Nice to have you. Listen, I want to begin here, of course, with the announcement that you made last night, because in making that announcement, you said that Canada needs to update the Investment Canada Act because of changing geopolitical realities. What exactly are you referring to there? Is it specifically China?
No, I mean, the law is agnostic, but what I see is that, and it's not only in Canada, you've seen that around our partners, the G7 partners, Five Eyes around the world, is that the geopolitical landscape has evolved a great deal since the Act was last reviewed. I think it's more than a decade ago. So this is about giving us more tool, more authority to be more agile, to go at the speed of business and make sure that, you know, with these new tools, we can better protect Canada's economic interests, but also our national security. And you've seen me in action already. I think Canadians know by now that when it comes to national security, there won't be ever a compromise. You know, I blocked recently when there was Chinese companies interested in taking ownership or part ownership of some Canadian mining company in lithium. I blocked that. So this is really country agnostic. So it covers any investments by a foreign entity of a Canadian enterprise. But it's about giving us more flexibility, more tools to make sure we can respond. For example, in some specific areas, we're going to require pre-notification. So if you have a non-Canadian entity who tries to buy a Canadian entity, for example, sensitive technology, critical minerals, anything relating to personal data, we'll ask for pre-notification. We can also impose conditions. So we know that in the context of intellectual property, if the transaction is completed and you ask for a divestiture, well, I would say the information has all been transferred. So we will want to prevent that. We'll impose conditions to say, for example, if it's IP related, you'll have to keep the entity separate to prevent this information from being transferred. We will also be able to impose undertakings, a bit like American colleagues are doing, because under the current act, it's either yay or nay. And now we will be in a position to say yes, but, and impose a number of conditions, for example, having Canadians on the board, making sure that the information stays in Canada, having higher penalties. So it's really revamping a law which is very crucial in order to protect our economic interests and national security in line with what's happening in the world now, more agility.
Yeah, well, let's break that up a little bit, because you talk about specific areas, and I'm wondering if there are sectors that you are more worried about than others, because I realize that there's a complete list that's meant to come out later, but off the top of your head, have you seen investments, deals that you find concerning? Are there sectors that you think require immediate attention?
Totally. Well, I would say artificial intelligence, quantum computing, cybersecurity, anything which has to do with personal data. we'll be like a hawk on these things to make sure we protect the interest of Canadians. Those would be the ones, if you ask me now, where we have already applied and scrutiny, but now we're going to be making that clear in the law, because I also appreciate that we need to provide businesses predictability. So they will know in advance that when it comes to these sensitive areas, there'll be additional scrutiny to protect our national economic interests and our national security.
Now, these amendments would give you or anyone who holds the industry portfolio, as you alluded to, the power to impose restrictions, temporary restrictions on companies who want to invest. You also can then go to the Minister of Public Safety to decide whether or not there needs to be a security review on a proposed investment. But all that said, I'm wondering, where does the transparency come in? Because if it boils down to the Minister of Industry and the Minister of Public Safety, where does Parliament come in to be able to judge whether or not that type of review is necessary?
Well, when it comes to national security, I would say, Michael, you always want to be as transparent as you can be with Canadians. But I think folks listening at home understand when it comes to national security, there's things that you cannot just put in the open because that would compromise national security. So we do that with experts. We do that with our agency, and whether it's the RCMP, whether it's the CSIS, our intelligence agency, it's never the ministry taking a decision in vacuum. It's a decision which is reasoned, which is based on evidence, and which is informed by our national security agencies, which provide the analysis, and then obviously it's for the minister to make a final decision. But I think there's a number of safeguards to make sure that these decisions are in the best interest of Canadians.
Do you worry about scaring away investment, though? And I understand there are national security concerns, but up against that is the reality that we as a country, we are a trading nation. We rely on foreign partners, foreign deals in order to create economic activity. Do you worry about scaring away companies?
No, not at all. Michael, listen, I've been on the road. I was in Japan. I was in South Korea. I just came back from Germany 2 days ago. I mean, we see a record level of interest in investing in Canada because we have what the world needs and what the economy of the 21st century needs to be prosperous. So I have no concern. At least I would even say that this is being applauded by our allies and partners around the world, because Canada is serious when it comes to national security. We're going to protect our critical minerals so they are available to our friends and allies around the world. We're going to protect sensitive technologies. We're going to be making sure that personal data is protected. I think it provides a level playing field with our partners of the G7, the Five Eyes. Everyone is upping their game because of the geopolitical context, which has changed dramatically over the last 10 years. And I think I'll never apologize for protecting the national security of Canada and protecting Canadians.
Okay, I hear you say that, but of course your announcement yesterday was made the same day that Radio-Canada broke that story about a government contract for RCMP Communications that was awarded to a company that has ties with the Chinese government. In fact, its parent company, Hytera, is facing 21 espionage charges in the United States. Does your bill, does your intent here get undermined when a government contract goes to a firm with such questionable ties?
Well, listen, it sent a signal in town that everyone needs to be more vigilant. I'm like you and Canadians, and I think the Prime Minister has been outspoken. We're all concerned about that. We need to get to the bottom of things to understand how could this ever happen. Obviously, the Invest in Canada Act is not targeted, I would say, at government contract. This is about foreign investment. But one thing that we just learned is that that contract has been suspended by the RCMP. I think it's the right decision, but now we need to go beyond that. We need to understand how could this ever happen. And I hope what I've announced yesterday is kind of sending a signal in town that everyone needs to be more vigilant, every department, every agency, when they're contracting. They need to take into account, like they always do, national security. But I think we need better processes to make sure that we are very vigilant to make sure that situation like the one you're mentioning does not happen again.
Minister Champagne, really appreciate the time today. Thank you for it.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Michael, for having me, and hope to see you soon.
Absolutely. Take care. Well, to continue our conversation now, let's bring in our political observers. Susan Smith is principal with Blue Sky Strategy Group, Kate Harrison, vice chair with Summa Strategies, and Kim Wright, principal for Wright Strategies. Hello to the three of you.
Good to be here.
Hello.
So I want to begin here with the last point that was made by the minister, and the point I was making to him as well in our interview. The question as to whether or not the government's credibility on security has essentially been diminished by the awarding of an RCMP communications contract to a company that has ties to the Chinese government. Now, that deal has been already rescinded, but it does go down to, I guess, an issue of credibility. Susan, what do you think of it?
Michael, I had a 2-word tweet when I saw this story yesterday, and it was my 2 words were monumentally stupid. This goes right to the heart of the officials, I think, who are looking at this project, and it goes to the heart of our procurement process here. We unfortunately have a process in Canada at the moment where it's lowest price for some projects, and that's what happened here, and nobody did their proper homework at the officials level. So I think the government has taken the right steps to cancel this contract. I think it's got to go further and get this technology ripped out. And Minister Champagne just yesterday in the House of Commons announced new updates to the Investment Canada Act that's going to require much more heightened review of these kinds of things and of these kinds of projects. And that it's disappointing that it happened. It's beyond a head scratcher. It's a slam forehead into palm of hand. But the government has to get smarter, and the government includes the officials who are looking at these things. The ministers' offices aren't looking at $500,000 contracts, which was the value of this contract. So this is incumbent on the independent public service to do their jobs too.
Kate, what do you make of it? Because, to hear it from the opposition, they basically say this proves that the government really is not backing up their own words when it comes to taking a tougher stance against countries like China.
Well, and this is just the latest example, Michael, of that being the case. This is not a one-off situation where the government made a whoopsie to a contractor. There's, of course, the longstanding issues with Huawei, our heel dragging on that, despite other Five Eyes countries deciding very early on that we were going to have Huawei technology. Chinese-owned enterprises were able to access some of the COVID benefits that Canadians were receiving, the wage subsidy benefits. So you speak about credibility, and that question to the minister is an important one. The pattern of behavior of this government not taking action on this soon enough has really made this a challenge. This is a pattern of behavior of them not taking security credentials seriously when they're looking at procurement. I'm glad to see the rules that are coming into effect, but I think a lot of people rightly are saying that it's too little too late.
Well, Kim, what's your take on it? Because, if not for the Radio Canada report, would the rest of the country have known about this deal? There's also that part of the report that essentially says that the main competitor for this contract was a Quebec-based company, and that, and this picks up on Susan's point, that the bid from the Quebec company was only $60,000 more. What's your reaction?
Yeah, so much of procurement feels these days like it's penny wise, pound foolish. And when we see that discrepancy of about $60,000 for a Canadian-based company that could have not only done the job, but just as well as the other company, there should be metrics in place that look at the value add to the country when they're looking at communications and any sort of procurement. This is not a new thing. This is just an increasingly frustrating thing. And what I find interesting, Michael, and this goes back to a bigger problem of procurement across the country, not just when we talk about foreign countries, but there isn't enough light shed on who is purchasing, who is procuring, and politicians and bureaucrats have taken the sort of don't ask us any questions because you have to have ill intentions when you do it. Sometimes procurement actually does need to have a light shone on it to see who's bidding, how they're bidding, how are these going through. And I think that that's part of the overhaul that needs to happen, not just in this instance, but across the country.
Mm-hmm. Listen, I want to switch over to guns right now because, as you know, big issue this week, the Prime Minister saying that his government is still very much committed to banning assault-style firearms and adding those amendments into their gun bill. Kate, there is apparently a fine-tuning happening based on the criticism that's been raised about this bill. What's your reaction to that?
Yeah, I think a lot of this heartache at this point for the government could have been avoided by more robust consultation at the outset. There was a lot of criticism when the bill was first introduced that it was too far-reaching, and now you're hearing groups like the AFN, for instance, step up and say, this is not going to respect the hunters and anglers in the Indigenous community. and it casts too broad of a net. So, there is a lot of consensus on the importance of tackling gun violence. Where there's less consensus is whether or not 21 is the right way to do it. And how will this meaningfully crack down on the real issue, which is firearms coming in from the United States, illegal handguns, already illegal weapons, as opposed to punishing law-abiding firearm owners. So I think they went out a bit too far on 21, and had they consulted broader earlier, they would be avoiding this legislative hiccup now.
Kim, I think it's very interesting to watch this debate happening because, of course, historically, New Democrats have called for gun control, but the amendments have party members in more rural parts of this country fighting back. How difficult is this issue for the NDP to navigate?
Well, it's interesting. It's taken the Liberal government since 2015 to create legislation that really just isn't going to solve any of the crime-related issues that we have in this country, including, as Kate mentioned, the porous border that we have that continues to allow illegal guns to come across this country, which is what 80% of the gun crimes that are happening in this country are. And former Chief Blair certainly knows that. He can certainly talk to this with great eloquence when he chooses to. And clearly, when writing this bill, no one in the government has chosen to figure out how we actually get a gun crime in this country. And part of that is, and not to be, discharitable this time of year, but they're not interested in getting at these major issues. The government is looking at scoring cheap political points. If people were actually interested in settling gun crime issues, we would have a much more robust plan. We would have a border security measure. We would have economic incentives for people in communities so they're not turning to guns and gangs issues. And so what we're seeing in the backlash of this is entirely predictable. What I didn't have on my bingo card on the gunnies issue was Carey Price wading into this and having to, and the coalition of firearms rights, so-called, cheapening this issue by any stretch of the imagination by using poly as a merch code, especially coming as we are this week on the anniversary of École Polytechnique and the femicide that happened in that instance. There is no reason that Carey Price did not know this. Certainly the Montreal Canadiens have had to educate him, as have a number of other folks. And this coalition, frankly, whoever thought that was a good merch code should give their damn hat a shake.
Susan, I wonder whether or not the Liberals are going to have to walk back the amendments at this point, because there is the opposition from hunters. There's now the opposition from the AFN, which just came out today, this week, and there's also the opposition even within the Liberal backbench. Will the government have to walk back those amendments?
I think you'll see some fine-tuning of those amendments. The Prime Minister said there's going to be more consulting, but the bottom line is a bill that restricts handguns, a bill that restricts assault rifles or assault weapons is a good thing. I think the implementation of the last amendment has been clumsy, and there have been some legit hunters who own legit shotguns and rifles that have been captured in this, and that needs to be walked back. Kate talked about further consultation. I think they should have done more of that. But to say, new legislation or any legislation, I think, that restricts the access and condemns the legality of these kinds of weapons, I think is a good thing in the country. That doesn't mean there aren't more measures that need to take place. But I think it's difficult to be against legislation that restricts the access of assault rifles. I understand how hunters could be upset, and so let's define what those specific guns are. But Kim referred to the sector or the industry and the lobby and the gun lobby. And that's a very wily industry who has come up with lots of ways to modify guns and make certain weapons assault rifles by increasing the magazines and the rapidity at which guns can, ammunition can be fired. That's what the government is trying to capture. The government is supportive of hunters, absolutely. They're supportive of people being able to go on the land and do their traditional hunting, or for people who do it recreationally. There's no question, and who do it safely with safe and legal weapons. But we've got to get rid of assault weapons. We don't need them.
Really, one last go around here, because I do want to get this topic. So quick answers from all of you, because I think it's important to acknowledge that Alberta has passed its Sovereignty Act now. And I'm wondering, how does that change, should it change, the way Ottawa does business with Alberta going forward? Susan, quickly.
Well, I think it's a case-by-case basis. There's a provincial election in Alberta next year, early next year. I think the government of Alberta thinking it can override federal law is fallacy, and I think there's going to be a lot of activity in court if they choose to actually activate and implement this law.
Kate?
Yeah, I think that it should give the federal government some pause in terms of their relationship with the province, their relationship with Saskatchewan. What we see here with the implementation of this is Alberta saying that they're looking for some of the protection and sovereignty, frankly, that provinces like Quebec have been given for some time. I suspect that we'll see a lot of use of this in the next 6 months, given the election timing. So we'll see how the implementation rolls out compared to the legislation that's now passed.
Kim, quickly to you.
I think we're rapidly approaching a conversation about what do we need to do to both keep the country together and reframe our constitution. I am, well, concerned about the Sovereignty Act, more concerned that the Prime Minister this week basically passed the buck on any sort of funding for municipalities or picking up the heavy load on many of the federal government's promises, including on housing, and saying, don't ask us for money. That's the province's responsibility. You're creatures of the province. I think we need to have a bigger conversation about how do we get that funding mechanism on the way beyond the politics of what's happening with Danielle Smith and her Sovereignty Act.
Okay, well, good to get your thoughts on the matter. In fact, all the matters today. Susan Smith, Kate Harrison, Kim Wright, really appreciate having the three of you today. Thank you.
Thank you.
The head of the World Cup's organizing committee came under fire this week. Human Rights Watch criticizing Nasser al-Qatar for showing what it describes as callous disregard for the death of a migrant worker from the Philippines. That worker dying at a training site for the World Cup in Doha. Now, Qatar has been accused of abusing foreign workers and also criticized for its treatment of the LGBTQ community. Matters I spoke about with the Minister of Sport, Pascale St-Onge, earlier this week.
Thank you for having me.
So I want to begin here with the World Cup taking place in Qatar. Of course, a historic moment for Canada after such a long absence. But you actually made the decision not to attend, and reports attribute that to your decision to stand in solidarity with the 2S LGBTQ community as well as foreign laborers. Talk to us about that decision.
Well, you know, I used to be a union leader, and everyone knows that I'm gay also. You know, even though the World Cup is a sport event, it's also, for government to send representatives, it's also for diplomatic reasons. So it was the right call to send Minister Sajjan, who's responsible for international development, who already has relationships with his counterparts in Qatar, but also all over the world. And it was the right moment to have those conversations about labor rights, about the LGBTQ community as well, and their rights. That's the call that our government made.
Well, as you say, you're gay. You're the first out lesbian serving in federal cabinet. Was Qatar even a possibility for you, or did you know from the start you would not be going?
Well, the important thing for me was to have the right person to have those conversations and advance human rights in Qatar, but also all over the world. And it's by having those conversations and good relationships with our counterparts that we can have those open and transparent discussions. And Minister Sajjan has worked on the international portfolio for a while. He already has those conversations. So it was the right call. And for me, it was about cheering for our team right here in Canada with the rest of my colleagues. You know, we watched a game when we had time during in the lobby in the House of Commons. So yeah, so you know, it's a sporting event, but for governments to send representatives, it's more about the diplomatic relationships and conversations.
Were you at all worried that perhaps they wouldn't have been as open to listen to criticism or commentary from an openly gay woman?
I think that those conversations are better when you already have a relationship with the people. And Minister Sajjan has worked for years building those relationships and bringing Canadian values in each of those visits, and you know, and build that trust and that openness. So and that's the context that needs to happen when you want to challenge other countries' values and policies.
And you talk about that relationship, and I think it's important to acknowledge the fact that Qatar did help out Canada in evacuating people with ties to this country from Afghanistan when Kabul fell. So given that relationship, and despite all the criticism, do you think the marker has been moved at all when it comes to labor rights, when it comes to spirit LGBTQ rights? Do you think that marker has been changed by Canada's involvement and Minister St-Onge's attendance?
Absolutely. There has been progress in Qatar about the labor rights. It's not perfect. There's still work to do. Same for the LGBTQ community that are still repressed in Qatar. But by building this kind of relationship with other countries, that's how we can move forward, our democratic values and social values as well. So nothing is black and white, and not talking to anyone and isolating like some people think that we should have done is not necessarily how we can improve people's lives in other countries that are repressed and are under a lot of pressure in regards to labor rights as well.
And when it comes to challenges, of course, Canada has its own. And we mentioned LGBTQ rights. I'm thinking homophobia in this country. And there was a new report out, and this was last week from Hockey Canada. And based on their own survey, players under the age of 18 in the 13 affiliated leagues with Hockey Canada, that age group was the most likely to discriminate on the ice, and the most likely insults, discrimination, were in the form of homophobia, transphobic slurs. Does that make you despair or worry about the future of hockey in this country?
It makes me worried about the state it's in right now. But the fact that Hockey Canada now has this data, that we know more about what's happening on the ice. There's always been speculation about the discrimination happening in toxic culture in hockey, but to have that type of data for the first time and know that those incidents happen so regularly, and particularly in that age group, I think it's going to help build a stronger plan to address those issues and better educate young players and prevent those situations from happening. And I really hope to see a lot of changes at the board of Hockey Canada with more diversity, so that it can trickle down all the way through the organization and have specific programs to address those issues. It's about sustainability of sport also. Canada is a super diverse country, and if sport organizations want to be relevant and appeal to kids and parents now and in the future, they need to make those changes and change the culture within sport, and especially hockey.
Well, of course, there was the revelation over the summer that Hockey Canada had, rather than investigate allegations of sexual assault, they paid off the victims who stepped forward in order to buy their silence. The board resigned. You had called for the resignation of the board. You talk a little bit about a trickle-down effect. Is the resignation of a board enough to trigger that kind of change?
No, it's not enough, but it sends a signal that it's no longer acceptable, that the status quo is not accepted by society, by players themselves, by parents, by the parents that pays the fees also, because we heard a really big response from sponsors, but also parents and affiliated organizations. So, but then we need to see new people around the table with diverse backgrounds and diverse expertise, especially in governance, because so many problems were happening right at the top of the organization, how they managed those cases, how they treated sexual abuse as an insurance policy instead of really fighting against that culture of sexual violence and the culture of silence. So. I think that something has begun, but we need to pay close attention and make sure that it does happen and that it's not just a once event, that it continues in the future.
How would it continue, though? Because, when you talk about sexual assault, and rather than listening to and investigating incidents of these allegations, they lean on misogyny and try to buy people's silence. So how do you change that? What are you looking for when you say that it can't be a one-time event? What would indicate to you that it's greater than this one-time event?
Well, there's different things. First of all, it was really important for us to have Hockey Canada signed with the Office of the Sport Integrity Commissioner so that independent investigations no longer are in the hands of the organization itself, but that there's an independent mechanism in place to investigate cases of abuse, maltreatment, sexual abuse. Of course, sexual abuse is always going to be a criminal offense. And like we saw about the allegations in 2003 and 2018, the local police have reopened their own investigations, and that's the right place to turn to when situations of sexual violence happens. But with the sports system, we need to have investigations about how those cases are managed, have the management taken the right steps to prevent these things from happening, and when they do, have they done the right thing by making sure that those that perpetrate criminal offense are responsible and are accountable for their own action. And that was the problem at Hockey Canada. So that was the first step, signing with the Office of the Sport Integrity Commissioner. What we're working on right now, and that's not just for Hockey Canada, but all sport organization, is we're going to bring in some new governance expectations so that there is more diversity around the table, so that the governance practices are better and conform with the norm and what should be happening on every board, and to have more financial transparency and education and prevention. So my goal as Minister of Sport is to bring in all the leadership I can to make sure that collectively everyone involved in the sports system, whether it's the organizations themselves, my counterparts in the provinces and territories that are responsible for community and provincial sport, that all of us do what is needed to prevent abuse and maltreatment in sport.
Mm-hmm. You've been the Minister of Sport for about a year. It's been quite the year that you've had to deal with a number of different issues. I think you alluded to it in part, but what do you hope your impact will be? At the end of the day, as the minister with this portfolio, what do you hope your impact will be? I
want to empower athletes. Because there's a lot of power imbalance in the sports system. Athletes' career depend on their coaches, on their organizations. So they need to have a stronger voice and more power to counterbalance that reality, and so that they feel safe in speaking out, so that they feel like they have a place at the decision table as well. Because it's about them anyways, and to make sure that all organizations and everyone involved in the sports system knows and understand that we're doing this for the athletes, and to make sure that they have everything they need to perform and be who they are, and also that they're safe and that they come out of the sports system as a healthy and wholesome human being.
Pascale St-Onge, thank you very much for the time.
Thank you.
Canada's premiers are turning up the heat, coming together this past week to push Ottawa for more healthcare dollars. They are also calling on the Prime Minister to meet with his provincial and territorial counterparts as a group, as they do want to revisit the funding formula for healthcare. Now, the Finance Minister did comment on the situation before the Premier spoke on Friday. Take a listen to Chrystia Freeland.
We understand that Canadians are really worried and frustrated and frightened, actually, in many parts of the country about the state of the healthcare system. And we know that we need to work together to make it better. The federal government is committed to doing that. And yes, that does mean some more investment, but it also means a focus on being sure we get the results that Canadians quite rightly expect of us from those investments.
With more, let's bring in our journalist panel. Marsha McLeod is with the Globe and Mail. Catherine Lévesque is with the National Post. Hello to the two of you.
Hello. Hi.
Marsha, I'm going to get you to start us out here, because the premiers are repeating really the same ask as we heard back in November when a meeting of health ministers did not resolve anything, really. So As we heard from Freeland, this for the federal government is more than just about dollars. It's also what Ottawa likes to call accountability. Why haven't the provinces met that demand if they're looking for more money?
It's a really good question, and it's one today that the premiers dodged during the press conference. Their repeated perspective was that they're accountable to their voters. And again, as you mentioned, Health Minister Duclos said as well that money is really not the only reason that the healthcare system is in crisis. But again, those premiers are demanding a meeting with the Prime Minister in January, looking for an increase in transfer payments with no conditions, and the federal government is really saying that they're not going to follow that line.
Mm-hmm. Now, Catherine, as the squabble over money continues, we are seeing a healthcare system tearing really at the seams. Millions of Canadians without a primary care physician, long wait times in emergency rooms, pediatric cases of respiratory ailments really just skyrocketing right now. Can Ottawa ignore, even if their demands not being met, can Ottawa really ignore these demands for more funding?
I wouldn't say ignore, but I think, yes, right now Ottawa can kind of for lack of a better term, sit back and kind of observe what is going on. I mean, Ottawa has been there, let's be clear, has been giving billions of dollars to the provinces during COVID. I think, obviously there's a crisis right now. I think they're open to giving more money, but right now what we're seeing is really a feud on the political side. And I think the mood, the public mood, certainly, and the political mood is kind of shifting a little bit because more and more people are seeing that provinces have surpluses. They have a lot of money. They can certainly invest in their healthcare system, and Ottawa sees it too. The other thing is that also the provinces are not, in fact, there have been talks with the provinces, with the health ministers, and Jean-Yves Duclos, in the last few months, he, unfortunately realized that this was more of a political issue, and now the premiers kind of stressed that today, that they don't want to talk with Duclos. They want to talk directly with the Prime Minister. However, I think Ottawa right now is kind of, again, asking for a bit more accountability. I think they put some water in their wine as to what they were asking for at first because they wanted more strings attached. Now they're just, asking for a shared database. They're asking for national norms in terms of the workforce. So it's getting more and more reasonable, but certainly I think it's time now the provinces put a little bit more water in their wine. And, for the Prime Minister to finally agree to sit at the table. But I don't know if it will happen before the budget, which is what their ask is right now.
Mm-hmm. And as you say, they are asking for more funding once the budget's actually tabled. So something we're going to keep watching in the weeks ahead. Now, Catherine, I'll stay with you because I also want to talk about China today. We saw the federal government unveil new strategies on critical minerals and foreign investment this week alone. National security, one concern that's being factored into both these announcements. Now, China was not mentioned specifically, but how big of a role does China actually play in these considerations?
A huge role. I think the message right now is that Canada is no more Mr. Nice Guy. We're, all the strategies that have been unveiled are unveiled with China in mind. We're more and more recognizing that it is a disruptive power. And really, it really speaks to this shift that is happening right now because, look, in the last mandate, certainly, Justin Trudeau, I think, was inspired by his father. I think he was hoping to get to have a nice relationship with the Chinese government as his father did. There were even talks in 2017 to potentially have a trade deal. That has completely changed. I think, the message now, the key message that we're hearing from the Prime Minister and from ministers is that they're, dealing with China with eyes wide open. So that's the message right now. And even though China isn't explicitly mentioned, that is certainly one of the countries that they're looking out for, and they want to make sure that China is protected. And so it certainly speaks to the shift right now happening in government.
Mm-hmm. And what's interesting about this, Marsha, is despite these policies that are really, again, meant to boost national security, we also saw the revelation this week of an RCMP contract that went to a company that has ties to China. In fact, more than that, its parent company is facing espionage charges in the United States. Talk to us about the reaction that story got in Ottawa and kind of the movement it has essentially inspired.
Well, it's certainly not been a good reaction. Conservative MP Michael Barrett has said he has a lot of concerns about this. He referred to a fox in charge of the hen house, and he was saying that he really wants to find out how this happened in the first place. And I think that is one of the central questions. How did this happen, and what are the RCMP's vetting processes during procurement to be able to avoid this happening again? I think that even in terms of Canada's policy on China, in a lot of ways, it has been sort of poked and prodded along a little bit by the U.S., who definitely is a few steps ahead. And just in this instance, the U.S. had blacklisted this company's parent company in 2001. So I think it raises a lot of questions about why Canada had not already done that, if that is something that may be in the works. The particular contract in question has been suspended, but no word yet whether it's going to be ultimately canceled. And maybe even just more broadly, I think it brings up that this is not the first time that there has been uproar over a RCMP contract. I mean, I think certainly Clearview AI comes to mind. There were concerns raised earlier this year about a spyware contract that the RCMP has, with whom it's refused to disclose who the specific contractor is. So this isn't necessarily a new conversation for the RCMP.
Now, that's not the only controversy that we saw this week, because we should also talk about the gun bill, Marsha, the Liberal gun bill, because, you know, the Assembly of First Nations, they did add their opposition against the bill as they wrapped up their conference this week. And it all goes to that amendment added after the initial bill was actually passed in second reading, in fact, in the House. Marsha, what was the thinking of adding that amendment at such a late stage?
I really wish I knew the answer to that question, because it certainly caused enormous uproar. It has the federal government, or the Liberal government, on its heels, responding to what has been enormous backlash from northern premiers, even from members of Liberal MPs as well. In particular, Brendan Hanley stepped out and said he doesn't support this bill. It's an MP representing Yukon. The Premier of Yukon said to me today that he doesn't support it, and because one of the main things is the amendments to the bill have really broadened its scope, and experts say that some of the newly prohibited guns don't even necessarily fit the government's own definition for what's an assault-style weapon, and it's going to target weapons that are very common with hunters, like the SKS. And so I don't necessarily know what the government can do at this point to cool this uproar, other than say maybe we'll scrap the amendment. Trudeau has said he's not open to negotiating the definition of an assault-style weapon, but they're open to fine-tuning. That's the word he's been using, fine-tuning the actual list of weapons that are prohibited. The government has added, or there's been 2 committee meetings added to kind of debate these very late-minute amendments. So we'll see what happens with that, but certainly this is not going to be wrapped up by the end of before the winter break.
Yeah, and Catherine, that was actually the point I wanted to raise with you, because as we heard from Marsha here, the bill will not be passed before the sitting actually ends next week. But is the bill itself now in trouble because of this amendment?
Well, certainly there has been a lot of uproar. I wouldn't say it is in danger as of right now, because something that also happened this week that kind of passed a little bit under the radar is the fact that the Bloc Québécois is actually quite open to supporting this amendment if they have a bit more clarity on what that involves, and if, of course, it doesn't hurt hunters and farmers and Indigenous peoples, of course. So listen, I think it's quite obvious that the NDP has a lot of frustration towards the bill. The Conservatives also, of course. But I think, in this case, the partner for the Liberals might be actually the Bloc Québécois, and they could have a majority to pass this. Now, how are they going to do that? Well, something that was agreed this week is in fact, it was the Bloc member who, raised the question of having more independent witnesses or experts to talk about, what is an assault rifle, an assault style weapon, and what should be in this list. So the Liberals, the NDP, and Bloc members on the Parliamentary Committee on Public Safety that is looking at this right now actually are asking for a special meeting to actually agree for future meetings. So there seems to be a bit more openness on that. So maybe that's what we might see in the next week and moving forward after Christmas. There will be more consultation, but I think, again, like Marsha said, the Liberals are committed to staying with this definition. I think now it's more about fine-tuning the list and really making sure that that this list does not affect the hunters and all the people who have been complaining about the amendment.
And of course, millions of Canadians are watching this right across the country, so we'll be watching it as well. Catherine Lévesque, Marsha McLeod, thank you for that, but stay where you are. As we said, the last week of Parliament before they rise for the holidays are coming up, so we'll talk about that a little later in the program. Earlier in the program, we spoke with the industry minister about new rules to govern foreign investment. And on Friday, we also heard from the resources minister as he laid out a roadmap for critical minerals that would help end a reliance on foreign money to develop the industry. Well, for his thoughts on the matter, we're now joined by Vincent Rigby. He is a former national security and intelligence advisor to the Prime Minister and is currently visiting professor at the Max Bell School of Public Policy at McGill University. Mr. Rigby, thank you for joining us.
My great pleasure.
Listen, I want to begin with this roadmap unveiled this morning by the Minister for Natural Resources, helping develop and sustain the critical minerals industry here in order to avoid an over-reliance on foreign investment. How important do you think this step is in terms of securing national security?
I think it's very important. I think it's another step that the government has taken in the last number of days, weeks, months, to really address the China challenge. And you're right, China is not specifically mentioned, just like China is not explicitly mentioned in the amendments that have been made to the Investment in Canada Act. But clearly, I think both of these strategies, both the Investment Canada Act amendments and the mineral strategy, are aimed at China to a considerable extent. So it's a welcome development, in my view, just like the Indo-Pacific strategy, which finally, I think, brought Canada a little bit more in line with Five Eyes allies and G7 allies, in acknowledging that there is a threat from China and that something has to be done about it.
Now, you say it brings Canada in line. So why is Canada so behind when it comes to our partners who've already made a decision about China?
Well, we are definitely behind. And I think that this is sometimes the case with these big strategic challenges. I've said on multiple occasions that Canada doesn't always take its national security as seriously as it should. I think this is partly a case of us being a northern neighbor of the United States. We can live under their security umbrella. We've never been the victim of a major attack, terrorist attack, or from a foreign country in Canada. So it sometimes takes us a little bit longer to get up to speed on some of these issues. And I think especially with respect to the China threat, we have been a little bit slow out of the gate. We've had also other issues that have been there that I think have played a part in that catching up process, including the two Michaels and some other issues with respect to China, economic, trade, prosperity issues. But it's good to see that finally these steps are being taken.
Now, we have seen Chinese interference in this country, the so-called police stations in the Greater Toronto area, the Metro Vancouver area, allegations that the Chinese Communist Party tried to involve itself in past elections. Has the federal government done enough to respond to the current challenges and concerns?
Well, there's no doubt that foreign interference is an issue here in Canada. It's not just from China, but from other hostile state actors as well, including Russia, including Iran, including North Korea. And so I think that we do need, in some ways, a comprehensive strategy to counter the hostile activities of state actors. But without a doubt, I think China is threat number one in that respect these days. And so, again, we're seeing some steps being taken to counter Chinese foreign interference activities. It was good to see in the Indo-Pacific strategy that foreign interference is explicitly cited and that Canada will do more to address foreign interference. But the proof is going to be in the pudding. And while amendments to the Investment Canada Act are welcome and the critical minerals strategy is welcome, I think some more specific measures with respect to foreign interference need to be taken at the end of the day. And there's been a lot of talk, for instance, about a foreign influence registry, private members bill that has come up. And that's something that I personally believe that we should be looking at very, very seriously.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned the Indo-Pacific strategy earlier, and of course that was unveiled by the government after much waiting. is it possible, do you think, to only work with like-minded countries? Because at this point, it seems very much that Ottawa is picking up the term that we heard from the United States, this friend-shoring issue, and moving away from China and looking for more like-minded states. Is it possible to move in that direction without hurting this country economically?
I think it's going to be very, very difficult. I mean, first of all, I think it's difficult right now to discern the Canadian strategy, notwithstanding the fact that we do have an Indo-Pacific strategy finally, but certainly the Deputy Prime Minister's comments about friend-shoring in the major speech that she gave down in the United States pointed in one direction. Indo-Pacific strategy is actually slightly in another direction. And while I think there's a lot in the strategy about working with our allies, while friend-shoring is not explicitly mentioned, there's an implicit recognition that we're going to have to do more with allies and friends in the region, Five Eyes, G7, et cetera. I think that the strategy is also very cognizant of the fact that it can't be just one or another. They can't be mutually exclusive at the end of the day. And we are going to continue to have to work with China, including commercially, economically, and with other countries where we have at times a difficult relationship, including even India, which is still, as I've said recently publicly, playing footsie with Russia. And yet we want to try and explore tighter economic relations with India. We have to try that as well. But this is not going to be easy. It's not going to be easy at all. And I think that we really do need to focus first and foremost on our closest allies and friends and how we confront this challenge. And at the same time, how we can work together economically. And I think that the critical minerals strategy is a perfect example of how we're catching up with some of our allies in terms of really trying to bring the critical minerals supply chains away from China, shift them away from China to the West.
Vincent Rigby, thank you for this. Really appreciate the time.
My pleasure.
Well, as we like to do, we're going to end the program today with a look at the week ahead. And joining us once again are Marsha McLeod of the Globe and Mail and Catherine Lévesque from the National Post. Thanks for waiting, guys.
Great to be here.
Catherine, we are approaching the end of the fall sitting, so a lot to discuss. But really, I want to begin here with what's the first major by-election since Pierre Poilievre became the leader of the Conservative Party. We're talking about the by-election in Mississauga Lakeshore, the riding in the Greater Toronto Area. Talk to us about the importance of this vote, given, I guess, the high-profile nature of candidates and also, again, the first one since Poilievre took over the leadership of the Conservative Party.
I think it's very significant. I think it might actually be a good test for Pierre Poilievre. Look, he's been also almost 100 days in the job. I mean, he's had the time to kind of start making his mark on the party, certainly. And now there's a by-election. Now his test, I mean, in the next general election will be to actually make gains in the Greater Toronto Area and the Greater Vancouver Area. Now we have this by-election in Mississauga Lakeshore. Look, I would say the Conservatives this week didn't, weren't very hopeful. I think they do recognize it is a hard area for them still, and they're the Liberal candidate certainly is a star. I mean, he's already been the finance minister. People know him, so they know it's going to be very difficult. I see kind of two roads here. Of course, if the Liberals win, as it is expected, I would say. I think it's going to be a bit of a hard hit for Poilievre. I think he's going to, have to question himself seriously and see, well, what can I do differently, next time to make sure that his candidates are elected in those areas. We've seen this week he actually spoke to the press gallery, which was a first for many months. So I think he wants to be more visible. Certainly, I think he recognizes that. If the Liberals win, of course, I think Justin Trudeau's leadership might be a good thing for him, actually, and people will kind of recognize that he still got it. On the other hand, if there is a surprising win for the Conservatives, I think that's going to be a very clear signal that what happened with the leadership race might actually happen in the next election, and I think that's going to be a red flag for the Liberals.
Well, Marsha, as we heard from Catherine, if the Liberals win this riding, they will be represented by a very high-profile person. We're talking about Charles Sousa, former finance minister for Ontario. And that is already sparking some speculation of a cabinet shuffle. How real is that possibility?
It's a good question. People are certainly talking about it on the Hill. The question of, is there going to be a cabinet shuffle in the new year, in the months ahead of the budget? But I think the thing is there's no obvious reason for one. The ministers who have some of the really big portfolios, they're not going to be swapped around. And I think the one thing would be if we start hearing of a minister who indicates they're not running for re-election, that might result in some somewhat minor cabinet shuffle. But I think we're not looking at a huge shakeup come the new year.
But something certainly we're going to keep an eye on. Listen, let's talk about this last week before the holiday break. Catherine, given that there's only a few days left, what are you watching out for?
Many things. I think there are some bills that we should be watching out for. I mean, C21 on the gun control bill, I think certainly will retain a lot of attention. But as we've mentioned, this will not pass in third reading. Certainly that's impossible before the holidays. Another bill that we should be watching for, and I'm told it's a priority by the government, is C18. The online news bill. So I think the Liberals will really be focused on passing that forward and potentially adopting it, at least in the House of Commons, to then be sent to the Senate. So those are kind of like what I will be looking for in the next week. But I don't think we'll have many bills that will receive their royal assent. I mean, I think certainly the legislative agenda will be quite thin. I think it has been quite thin for a while. So that's really what I'm going to be looking for before we leave for the holidays.
Okay, before I leave for the holidays. Marsha, what are you watching out for?
I'm going to be interested to hear from our Federal Auditor General, Karen Hogan. She's going to appear before a committee in the upcoming week, and she's obviously just released pretty blockbuster reports on pandemic aid spending and her findings that there's a need for review of many billions in payments. So I'm really curious what she's going to share before that committee.
Okay, well, again, the last few days before the end of the year, but for this analysis today, Marsha, Catherine, thank you for the time.
Great to be here.
Thank you.
And I'm Michael Serapio. For everyone here at CPAC, thank you for watching us today and this past week. We'll see you again next time.